Nice one.
There we go. All good. Well, they can, kind of miss out on the spiel about what the creator economy is and dive in right with the blockchain bits.
Right, the good stuff. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So with all of that, I just want to mention, so blockchain can revolutionize how the world manages intellectual property in massive ways. It's extremely dynamic, and in nearly every single area of intellectual property, from how it is as assets, as these sometimes intangible assets, how they are defined, how ownership is defined over these assets, how we then lay out and define the actual licensing, the rights, the IP rights over these assets, and how we share those rights and control, and also things such as royalties, which derive from these assets, and how do we share them with other individuals, other actors, other businesses in this global system. And blockchain is truly something that's going to, if anything, really redefine this system. But before all that, let's go ahead and dive into, what is blockchain? So very simply, blockchain is a shared immutable ledger, and excuse me for just reading off the bat here, ledger that facilitates the process of recording transactions and tracking assets in a business network. So in simple terms, I guess going back old school, if you were to imagine an accounting ledger, so anyone who's taken accounting fairly should be familiar with what this is. Essentially, you have your balances, your assets, and there are a bunch of credits and debits. So essentially, there is this starting amount, and it's able to be seen, it's recorded. And as the math goes, when one amount is debited, so taken away from this, it's because it is credited, it's added over here, to this other account, this other individual, and so on and so forth. Now, a blockchain is essentially a digital ledger. So it seeks to provide, in a very simple way, the same service of keeping an immutable. So it's on chain, and how it's immutable I get to in a moment, but providing this global and immutable ledger for assets. Now, these assets aren't necessarily always just a financial medium, like say Bitcoin. So Bitcoin and its fundamental utility. So like, what is the purpose of this blockchain? Because there are many different blockchains since the creation of Bitcoin. Bitcoin was created, and its blockchain is used to, in the most simplest form, actually is as big as it is, but in the most simplest form, just be a public ledger. So it has an asset, and the Bitcoin blockchain is essentially just this financial ledger, which is recording transactions and balances of the Bitcoin token. And the purpose of it is only to act as a financial medium. So Bitcoin serves to function in an economy in the same way that the dollar or the pound or the euro would operate in an economy. It's just a financial medium, which I use to exchange for goods and services. Now, since the creation of Bitcoin, blockchain has expanded and grown into a monstrous industry, let me just say. So with that, we record so much more than just a single token such as Bitcoin, which in the minds of some is to replicate the use of a dollar or euro pound. Now, because of technologies built on top of blockchains, we're also able to create assets called NFTs, which I'll talk about later. And these assets are essentially certificates of ownership over other assets. So in the same way that you have a deed or a title to your house, or you have a car note that you pay, but you also have your actual registration, which ties ownership of the vehicle to yourself. It's a piece of paper that is essentially, it's a document that is stored. You have a physical copy, but there's the digital record of it, which is stored in a private database in the US, be it the DMV or with the government and institution. Now, in the same way that those digital records of ownership are stored in their private databases, it's the same exact concept, except we're storing these records of ownership on this public database, on this blockchain. It's a really good way of kind of looking at it. So the actual house itself is not stored on the chain. However, record of ownership over that house is what is stored on chain. So going into exactly, what makes a blockchain tick, what makes it this immutable, powerful machine. So where the name comes from is, so there's two things, talk about the block and the chain and where that comes from. So each block is essentially a block of data. Each block, I don't want to get too technical jargon here, but each block typically has X amount. There's a limit of how much data that can be stored per block. Competition over getting your transaction in the block is what in the past typically causes like high transaction fees. You have to do pay in the networks, the blockchain's native token. You have to pay in order to use the network. You pay to cover transaction fees. And these transaction fees are essentially you paying to have your data, the transaction that you're performing, included in a block. This block is then filled up, it's stored. And what happens is the very first transaction of this block links to the very last transaction of the block that came before it. Now, the very last transaction in this block will also link to the very beginning or the first transaction in the block that comes after it. And this is what essentially creates that chain that we're talking about, and links each block to the next, creating this blockchain. It's what gives it the name. So some key elements of a blockchain include the fact that it is a distributed ledger, and there are immutable records. So being a distributed ledger, what this means, decentralization of the network. So on a global scale, anyone around the world can run and operate what's called a node. Instead of in the world of Web 2, as we call it, when you go and you surf the internet, you are connecting to a bunch of private databases that are all pointing to, they all have different channels that get pointed to, that you route to through HTTPS and all this whole thing I'm not going to get into. But essentially what it is, the internet is comprised of a connection of all these private databases. Now, with the blockchain, it's very similar to how you could imagine the internet, except instead of private databases, it's just a bunch of individuals running nodes. And all of these nodes share the same state. So they all share the same history. And essentially what they do is they're constantly, apart from pushing new transactions and updating, but they're staying in harmony. They're always synced and everything is always matching up. So together as a collective, they run these nodes, which then makes the network, realizes the network and makes it accessible. The fact that these records are immutable is also very key here. So when it comes to things such as trust, that's really like, what does blockchain solve? And the answer to that is trust. Let's say if a private company were to create with a private database that nobody had access to, nobody could see the code, nobody could check a public ledger of transactions. And this private company is like, yes, we're coming out with the value token. We call it VAL, whatever. And they say that there's X number, there's 1,000 of these tokens, and there's $1 million in this pool backing their value, and they put them on a market. The issue here is that because everything's private, who's to say that there's only 1,000? Who's to say that there's 1,000 that the public is aware of, but really the private company has 100,000 and they're secretly, they could be selling it off to the community, to other people, or they could even be going in. Someone could at one point have a balance, and then they go and they log in one day and it's gone. Poof, it's not there. Without the proper, history, they don't really have the means, the ability to go in and dispute the fact that they did or did not have that balance. So keeping this in mind, blockchain eliminates essentially all of those pain points to where we can have this global system where any individual can go in, can check the validity of things. We know that there are not, for instance, once one block is created, so once a new chain in the block is established, one cannot go back to an old block. They cannot insert new data into an old block. They cannot change the ledger. And this is very important when establishing the system, especially a global system. And when it comes to things such as intellectual property, very important here, because if we are talking about, rather than just a domain specific environment for managing intellectual property, for collaborating with individuals, we're talking about this global system. It's very important that we don't need to trust the other person, because to be honest, how can we? Otherwise you don't actually know what someone may or may not have intentions for when we're talking about identities and actors over the internet. It's one of the funny pain points actually of Web 2 when we call it Web 2, but when the internet first arose, there's a lot of people, everyone was saying, you can't trust anything on the internet. Everything's a scam. A lot of things are still scams. It's a bunch of people, shadowy super coders, and you can't trust none of it. But today we do have this rather kind of flourishing economic system that is either growing on the internet or being bolstered by it. But the funny thing here still is the fact that, yes, there are a lot of issues, and you actually can't trust a lot of other individuals that you're interacting with, people that you meet, let's say if you want to collaborate with someone that you met in a chat room, that you met online. You can work with these individuals, but throughout this entire process, there is trust. You have to trust the other individual because there are no safeguards otherwise in place to protect you. And one of the big things about blockchain is it lays the foundation for an environment where you don't need to trust other individuals, at least in terms of trusting that they have what they have, that they are going to send what they're going to send. Let's say if you have an agreement, I'm going to give you X, you're going to give me Y. Or even when it comes to use rights, which I'll talk about later. If you give someone a digital asset, being able to put in some restrictions on the do's and don'ts of what they essentially have power over when it comes to it. Another really important, if not maybe the most innovative component of blockchain since their creation, are smart contracts. Smart contracts are, if you ever hear the term DApp or a decentralized application, 90% of the time, a DApp is comprised of smart contracts. So like I was mentioning earlier, you can have a private company and they have a program, but it can be changed technically. Anyone in that company who has the access could go in, could change the code, could change the way the program works, could even change the state or the history of things that, part of the database from that program. And these are all concerns. Now, when it comes to a smart contract, instead of the program being controlled, part of, it's saved as part of this private database and this private server, rather than this being the model here, with smart contracts, you have your program, your code, it has a set of conditions typically, if this condition's met, then, this trigger will happen. And what happens is this program is saved and deployed onto the blockchain itself. It's deployed onto the blockchain, and once deployed, it cannot be changed. If somebody wants to, for example, upgrade or come out with a newer version of their DApp, then what they would do is they would have to deploy a new smart contract, which is then more accurate. It reflects what their new version is. Smart contracts are incredibly important, though, and it's definitely a topic. I could go on and talk about smart contracts and all the different use cases they have, all the different ways that they're able to impact different industry sectors. However, that would, let alone, probably be a 10-hour spiel. But very exciting stuff that I recommend anyone who's interested, in your spare time, go out, try and learn a bit more about smart contracts, their use cases. But in a nutshell, the really important thing here is that smart contracts are used to create essentially trustless agreements. So you can codify nearly any agreement, any logic, any business logic based agreement. So let's say, I'll give a really basic example of a smart contract. And this is really what's given life to, we call it DeFi, decentralized finance. So with DeFi, you have a very simple smart contract, and it's for an asset swap. It makes it to where they put in, I have 100 of this token. I'm going to send 100 of this token to this account. And in the same breath, in the same action that I send my tokens, they're going to send this asset or these tokens. So it's a different one. Rather than you needing to send, they verify, okay, cool. And now I'm going to send it to you because there's a bit of trust right there. It eliminates that. And it's just in one breath, it does the swap, does the transaction. And nobody can go in and as long as you're using the smart contract here that I described, no one can go in and change it after it's been deployed. So no one can go in and then change the code and make it to where, oh no, in fact, you're going to send this and then nothing happens. No one can go in and change that. So it's very important. Now that's very simple though, or regarding what a smart contract can do. Smart contracts can get very complex. And one of the things that we're pioneering here at the InvArch Network are what we call smart licenses. So essentially, it's a take of using smart contracts with intellectual property licensing to codify, in simple terms, codify the terms, the agreements, the conditions of intellectual property licensing agreements between multiple parties, provide them in the form of a smart contract so that they can be deployed on chain so that an individual can essentially license their intellectual property using these smart contracts. And what that does is, in this example, so someone can have an asset and let's say on this asset, there are what we would call callable functions. So there are certain things it can do. You could send this asset, you could edit this asset. You can, in certain systems, you can share this asset with other people. You can divide ownership. You can license it further, but you can also restrict. You can say that here's a token that I'm going to provide, and imagine it's like a key. So this key allows someone to do A, B, C, but not D. Whereas I can have a different key that allows someone to do only A, not B, C, or D. And hopefully I'm not losing people there with all the numbers and variables, but it allows individuals to define custom IP licensing agreements over their assets, and then using these smart contracts, essentially share those assets under certain terms and agreements with other actors. Very powerful stuff. But also, I just want to add, apart from intellectual property, just one of the massive impact, but one of hundreds, if not thousands, of different ways in which smart contracts can be used to facilitate trustless agreements between multiple parties. Very, very important, very powerful technology. Very nerdy, but it's really awesome. It's really, really powerful. What can be done using smart contracts and just all the different ways that smart contract technology is going to change the future, essentially just change the way that as a global society, we're able to conduct business and collaborate together. So with all that, and I want to jump into a bit more, something that's been a bit more popular lately, which are non-fungible tokens, or NFTs. Now, I want to start this off by saying that NFTs are so much more than like the Bored Ape Yacht Club pictures and things like that. Not to knock them, I'm always grateful for the attention that they brought to the technology. However, those are by all means the most basic and simplest form of what an NFT is and can do. So simply put, an NFT is not the actual like data file. It's not that JPEG. The NFT is a record of ownership. Imagine between you, the individual, the owner, and the assets, the data itself. The data itself, so the JPEG, this picture file, is stored most often on something that we call IPFS. It has a really cool name. It's an interplanetary file system. So basically, IPFS is this global distributed database network. The actual data for the JPEG is stored there. It's not typically stored on chain because blockchains are not made, they're not designed to store that much data. It would make the chain extremely slow and extremely expensive, which is not good. So we kind of offload these tasks to something like IPFS, which is where the data is stored. And now there's this non-fungible token, which is on chain. And what this does is this non-fungible token, obviously it has a unique identifier, but it also has something that we call metadata. And the metadata is pointing to the file's location on IPFS. So it's linking it all together, linking the data to you and acting as this record of ownership on chain. So that is important. It's also important to note that this is, in the sense, what does give them their value is they have this unique identifier. So whenever someone online, if I will say this, when they make the joke of right click, save as, I'm gonna steal your JPEG, I'm gonna steal your, nobody cares. Nobody who has the asset actually cares, because that's not the point of having the NFT. Typically having the NFT, having this unique identifier, which is then cited in additional programs or in another smart contract, makes it to where you, as the owner of that NFT, you either have, or all of which, exclusive access to certain groups, but then also rights to further rewards. So I know I was kind of knocking on them earlier, but the people who did own do own a Bored Ape Yacht Club, one of those NFTs, someone has this NFT, and no doubt that there are thousands of people across the world who have then right-click saved as, and they made it their profile picture too. But what's not happening to those people who essentially, copied the image is, since their release, those holders have been given additional NFTs, and access to certain games and events, of which for many of these people, the value that has been airdropped to them, as we call it, it's been over $500,000, if not more. So at least $500,000 in, from their point of view, just free earnings per se that they've gotten. And now, if you copy that image, you never get any of these things because you don't actually have the NFT. This unique identifier that's being referenced isn't linked or connected to you. And that's really what kind of helps make that system work there. But as I was saying, NFTs are a lot more than just these JPEGs. NFTs have the ability to essentially be these records of ownership over so many different forms, almost nearly every form of digital content that's out there. So yes, we've seen them with art, but also when it comes to music, when it comes to video film, even when it comes to code bases. So the ability to store your code, your program as an NFT, and store the record of ownership over this code base to you or even multiple people's accounts, their identities. This is very important, especially when it comes to intellectual property. So when we're talking about IP and NFTs, it's not necessarily, we're not referencing NFTs as the actual, like the asset itself. So if I had a song, the NFT is not the song. However, the NFT can be used to record my ownership, my licensing ownership over this song, and then attached to this NFT. So this NFT essentially being the common denominator of IP ownership can now be, can then have additional tokens pegged to it, which is where we get a little bit wonky, but can have tokens that are pegged to it, which represent different use rights. And these different use rights can then be facilitated and given to other individuals, granting them those rights over the asset in this digital domain. A really important thing that I need to talk about also briefly, I realize I'm rambling a little bit longer than I thought here, my bad. Another important thing are decentralized autonomous organizations. This is probably the one thing I'm most passionate about, and I truly firmly believe that DAOs, as they're called, are going to completely reshape the future economic landscape. The economy of DAOs is going to be amazing, and one day it's going to be very commonplace for someone's place of employment to simply be at a DAO, or for them to be a contributor or a member of a DAO. And I guess the easiest way to imagine a DAO is it's a collective of people working together. So in a typical business, you have an executive, typically you have an executive or board of executives, but within a certain department, there's an executive and they call all the shots most of the time. With a DAO, you alleviate that executive authority and you essentially democratize it and allow the participants in this DAO, in this organization, to vote together on chain in order to govern what should be done. So a DAO, more often than not, consists of a treasury. So this treasury holds assets. They vote on how to spend those assets in order to achieve whatever their underlying objective is. DAOs can come in a lot of different flavors. And the reality is that the technology is still very young and the proper tooling is close, but not quite there. It's one of the things that we're building. But with all of this, and in the future, what we will see, I'm very confident, is you'll see DAOs, so these decentralized bodies working together, governing things such as intellectual property over what is it they're building. Also, you'll see DAOs deciding on how marketing efforts should work. You will have one DAO, I imagine, we'll see a DAO where there is a democratized body that determines the general direction of the company, but then you also have a DAO that determines the general direction and how to manage, let's say, marketing efforts. You can have another DAO which focuses specifically on development efforts, and you can have one body that essentially is the core body with the core treasury determining the budgets of different, what I would call a sub DAO. But I don't want to get lost in all that because it's a whole big topic to get into. But DAOs are very important. The critical thing here is to understand that they are on-chain entities. They're not a single person. They are becoming increasingly recognized as actual legal business entities. But in this sense, I want you to imagine a DAO as a digital entity that lives on chain, not in the real world, but in the same senses. Bear with me, but just as you are a real world entity in this domain, imagine a DAO as your equivalent in this digital domain. Hopefully I didn't lose anybody there. So as I was saying, what does all this have to do with intellectual property? Well, and this is where I'm really just going to dive in there and get really jargon heavy and hopefully invoke a lot of questions from people. Hopefully, I imagine I'm talking to a very bright group of students. So I know that individuals probably resourceful here, but I saw a question from Grace. Did you still have a question?
No, sorry. That was on purpose.
Oh, no, you're fine. It's okay.
I'm sorry.
You're okay. I just didn't want to make sure I didn't want to ignore you. But so yeah,
Thank
as I
you.
was saying, with no problem. With all of this, so yeah, right here, there's a lot of, I'm just throwing it all at you guys. And the big thing here is, hopefully I excite some people and there's some stuff that individuals can then go and research on their own. And maybe one day in the future, I can talk to some of you in more detail about some of these things. But so in a nutshell, how can blockchain affect IP rights and ownership? And I want you to use your imagination here. Imagine a DAO. So you have this digital on-chain entity and you have an asset. Let's say it's a storybook. Now, typically, you have an author or authors and they have the ownership rights over this. Now, because of the varying legal systems surrounding IP, it gets very sticky when it comes to collaboration and IP ownership. Technically speaking, if two individuals are for something and one person is against, then nothing can be done. It's not a majority rule type of system here. It could be 99 people want to do something that have ownership rights and one person who has ownership rights. If they say no, then that's that. So it's a very crippling system if you were to think about trying to have this democratized ownership over NFTs, or not over NFTs, over IP using NFTs. So the solution here is that rather than those actual participants, these actors, or in this case, these authors being the owners of the IP, it's this DAO, this on-chain entity that is the owner of the IP. And this DAO then facilitates different use rights to the contributors. It can facilitate governing rights, it can facilitate royalty rights, and then it can also facilitate rights to outside individuals, to other parties, to use or even extend the original works of intellectual property that are produced through and owned by this DAO. Using a DAO, so using an on-chain organization as a facilitator for IP rights while retaining ownership itself, is one of the novel features of the InvArch network that we're building. And it's what allows for in a global digital domain, this global digital system, it allows individuals to not directly, but through this DAO, actually then share ownership and be able to collaborate together smoothly, be able to govern over assets using things such as majority rule, or a whole array of different voting models will be available for individuals. Individuals can even set like custom voting agreements. It gets really wonky and really flexible what can be done. But the point here is that we are slowly kind of able to replace, or if not emulate, current world systems with blockchain solutions, because in the real world, what would have otherwise been done is there's typically a third party, a trusted entity that you often have to pay a lot of money for, which is not attainable by the average person, to help facilitate the shared rights amongst, let's say, co-authors over something. Typically, people don't go down this road. They They don't get all complex. If there's multiple authors working together, they'll have some simple, proper licensing agreements in place between the two, but very rarely do they get more complex or intuitive than that. And reasons for this, I would say one is there's not a clear monetization path for them. So there's not really a reason for them to do that. But then also the system is very complex, and the average person isn't necessarily a fan of overly complex systems. And IP rights, registration, licensing can, for the average person, usually be perceived as an overly complex system. Whereas blockchain solutions can streamline a lot of these processes, and if not, kind of replace some of them with more ideal services altogether. Now, a really powerful thing here, and it's that third bullet point I want to mention real quick. So DID credential attributions and signatory solutions. Dang, that's a mouthful. But so DID, that's the important thing. So decentralized identities, or something they're called self-sovereign identities as well. This will be huge. And I'm very confident that this sector of blockchain technology, this field of solutions, is something that, for a fact, our children or grandchildren will definitely, it'll be a common point, commonplace, common feature of their life, so to speak. But essentially what this is on-chain. It's the ability for someone to have a verified identity, verified credentials, and also to own. Imagine like you have your real wallet. Now here in the US, it's a bit of a redundant system, but here in the US, I have birth certificates, I have a license, I also have a social security card, which is linked to taxes. Really all three just linked to me as an individual. And what happens is whenever I want to conduct business, or let's say if I want to get a loan, I need to prove that I'm me over and over and over again for every single instance. And when I do this, back in, when applying for a job, I would have to provide my social security card, I have to provide my ID, got to prove that I'm me. And every single time that I do that, someone then keeps a record of it. Or for example, Equifax with credit scores, they all keep a record of it and they store it it's a private database. And now it is susceptible to getting hacked, which is what happened to Equifax. And I'm not sure even if it was a global thing, but at least in the United States, millions of people had their personal identity information essentially leaked or stolen from them. Very dangerous system. And that point of failure is in the fact that you have to continuously share it with people over and over and over again. With the DID solution, imagine you have your credentials and you prove, let's say you prove it to someone once, or to what we would call an attester. And so in my case, the federal government, one time they sign off and there's this verification of, yes, these documents are legit. These are credible documents. Now, every single time that I go and I want to conduct business, I don't need to share the documents again. I just need to share the proof of their verified, that the fact that they've been verified through this system. And because this is all on a blockchain, it's what allows it to work. It's a little off topic here, but the big thing here is that DIDs are very important because now in this blockchain domain, we can have proven verified credentials, and people can now connect these credentials, their identities, to these assets. So in the same sense in which the real world, it's very important that we're able to attribute our identities to our intellectual property. This is absolutely necessary if we are to talk about emulating the current system, but in a blockchain environment. So using things such as what we're building here with the InvArch network, but also using what I just talked about, these DID solutions that other teams, other projects are building. When you connect these technologies, this is when you can start to see this more global framework for intellectual property come about, where you can emulate nearly every single instance of like the current process that we see with institutions when it comes to registering, managing intellectual property. We can emulate all of those, but on-chain. And the thing is that we can facilitate these processes a lot faster and a lot cheaper, and I dare say a lot better than what the average person in charge of these decisions can do. And the most important thing here also is that it provides an opportunity to establish a global domain, a global environment where these laws, these procedures are ultimately governed directly by the people. This is through on-chain governance and through token holdings and things like that. But the system can be controlled and governed by the people, but it's a global system, and we can create a global, more harmonic system for collaboration regarding intellectual property. So the ability to share ownership, to work together, to build together, to also share in royalties and revenue and monetization, and to encourage this and essentially save people from getting what I like to call Zuckerberg, which is where you have the Winklevoss twins in a closed room and no proof share an idea, well, with little proof, share an idea with another individual, Mark Zuckerberg, and things go from there. And they did win a court case, but they didn't become the multi-billionaires that he became. So essentially creating a digital environment where things like that are, if not impossible, at least very easy to defend against. So as I was saying, in simple terms, the entire intellectual property global framework is being reinvented. It's evolving. When it comes to intellectual property, this is a field that like I said, it's a broad area. IP is broad. It plays a role in essentially every other sector of the economy. Because of that, in the same way that a financial medium like the dollar, the euro, or the pound plays a role in our day-to-day life, IP is present in our day-to-day life, and it's something that can be better facilitated using blockchain technology. It's also something that I believe can be used to make the lives of, in this case, I would say like many attorneys, easier. Blockchain will change. It's going to change the way in which intellectual property is handled going forward. It is evolving, as I said, currently. So I have a good feel in the general direction in which we're heading, but the point is that it's a public effort here. So blockchain, I'm very certain, will replace many systems that we see today, which might intimidate some people. But on the other hand, it will also help to make the lives of many people like so much easier. So giving, for example, attorneys more verifiable proof and evidence that they need to support their clients, to whether it's an attorney, like a litigator, but you could also have someone who's just helping with IP licensing in general. And the fact that we can now trustlessly, or in the future soon, we'll be able to trustlessly facilitate a lot of these agreements. It allows the same level of business to get done, if not more, but with less strain and less stress on the actual individuals who are participating in this system. A big thing also, and one little last topic I want to talk about, a really cool thing about blockchain is it's also going to change how we're able to fund intellectual property and fund development. So blockchains provide access to these global systems. And with that, and at least in our case, one of the things that we're building with the InvArch network, we call it the OSIF protocol, stands for On-Chain Innovation Funding. And a really cool thing about this, very like common good aspect of it, is it allows anyone or any DAO in this case, so any organization that controls and owns intellectual property, the assumption is they want to build something. So any DAO is able to register onto the network, and the global community is able to essentially vote and decide on where they would like network funds to go to help kickstart innovation, to subsidize innovation, or even if they want not just network funding, but they want to provide their own funds to help support something. And we make sure to provide an array of different funding channels. So there's streamlined funding, where you can have an organization essentially register onto the network, people vote, and there is inflation that comes from the network. There's a token supply. There is inflation of 10% every year of the token supply. And where that inflation goes is towards supporting growth and development on the network. However, exactly where it gets sent to is decided by network participants. So they vote with their tokens. 40% of that emission from inflation goes to them. 60% goes towards the project. So there's an incentive cycle here. But then we also have donation funding, which we're coming out with. And this is very straightforward. It's just the ability for someone to either directly, donate funds from themselves to an organization, or There were rewards that I had mentioned earlier for people who are participating in this process. They can choose to forego some or all of their rewards and donate them instead to a project. So coming to the V3 here, a project in exchange, then, rather than just being registered and looking to kickstart funding, a project or a DAO itself could be looking to democratize ownership over itself. So they could be offering governance tokens, and individuals could choose to divert some or all of their, we call staking rewards, but the rewards that they were getting, and they could, instead of donating them, they could send it to a different organization that's going to give them something in exchange. And then finally, there's also milestone-based funding. So this is, obviously there's a bit more criteria, and this is more specific rather than being at the whims of, we get however much we get based on the people's vote based off of inflation. Organizations will have the ability to essentially make grant requests to the network, milestone-based grant requests, and then the network can vote to either to approve those, deny them, and then also to approve and accept milestones, and then provide funding based on that basis. So yeah, that's my big spiel on everything. I know I covered an array of different topics here, but like I said, the truth is this is just the beginning. This field of technology is still very young, very nascent, and even with that, it's extraordinarily powerful what we've been able to come up with in terms of innovation over the past over the past decade from Ethereum, but beyond that, since Bitcoin. And it's only going to keep getting crazier in a beautiful way. And what I mean there is, as more time goes on, more use cases are sure enough they're to come about, but also more minds will come together to work on solutions like we're building here at the InvArch Network. And as we get more public discussion, more global insights and input from others in this, then that's when we will then begin to see truly vibrant, community first, and globally desired systems come about. But yeah. Like I said, the truth is it's just the beginning. There's so much that's going on here at the InvArch Network. Specifically, what we're doing is we create primitives. So these NFT primitives that allow individuals to, to store, define, they store the actual asset on IPFS, which I mentioned earlier, but to define records of ownership over intellectual property, to provide a system, a DAO system, to allow other individuals to collaborate together over this to facilitate use rights agreements. But there are so many other things that are still left, that are still needed to be created. And for example, we could even see one day on-chain arbitration systems. I think that would be really fascinating. And that's something that we'll see in the future. We'll see, like I said, more advanced DID solutions. And we'll also begin to see more streamlined services for these on-chain DAOs to actually register as legally recognized businesses in the domains of certain countries. There's still a lot to do. There's still a lot to go. It's really exciting though. So I definitely encourage anybody who has the slightest interest into blockchain to definitely give it a look. Prior to getting into blockchain, I actually used to work for the US government. I was not necessarily a tech person. I was always tech savvy, but I was a political junkie. From the day I was 13, like my friends thought something was wrong with me because I was obsessed with it. And a lot of that transfers to with what I do now, talking about these decentralized organizations and governance and everything. But the point I'm trying to get at is this isn't something that's just for the tech minded. It's not just for developers. This is something that truly anyone who has that fire inside of them and they want to make a change, they want to have an impact. This is an industry where the channels, the opportunities to do so are abundant. So yeah, I definitely encourage anyone with that type of interest or calling to give this a good and firm look, and understand that it doesn't necessarily have to be your only life path, but this is a field that can integrate with, I imagine, whatever other outside interests you have, whether it's law, pharmaceuticals, even automotive and logistics. It overlaps and has a way to profoundly impact for the better and change all of these different industries. So yeah, that's me. That's my spiel on blockchain, on intellectual property. There's honestly a lot to talk about. There's so much to talk about, and it's hard to pack it all into this presentation, which I have gone way over the original 30 minutes I thought it would take me to do. But yeah, that's me. Well, that's InvArch, that's intellectual property, blockchain. I'm Dakota Barnett, and we have our socials here on this last slide for anyone who is interested in learning more or following along specifically about what it is that we're doing and what we're building. And with that, yeah. Thank you. I just want to say thank you
so much for the talk, Dakota.
Thank you. And to the Oxford Law Society for having me.
I think we'll open the floor now to questions, but thank you again for an amazing talk. If you could just raise your hands, and then Dakota, you choose who you want to ask a question.
Okay. Sounds good to me. Although let me stop sharing real quick so I can, because the sidebar is kind of odd. There we go. All right, I see two hands. I hate saying names wrong. That's the one thing I hate saying names wrong. So if I do, I apologize unequivocally for butchering any names. Dang it. Jardine,
you're close enough.
Okay, close enough. Sorry about that.
No worries. I just wanted to ask, like you say, this area is growing, and obviously it's has an abundance of use. How long do you think it would take for it to become so global? Because you talk about this like idealistic world where all of this is used everywhere on the global. How long do you think that'll take? Because obviously it's exponentially getting faster.
Yeah, so I love that question. And I think you already understand like the factors behind my answer. The rate of adoption it's exponentially faster. I will say it's hard to pinpoint exactly where. See, I would say the optimist in me wants to say within 10 years, I'm not going to say not 100%, even like the internet today still isn't at 100%. But compared to the use rates that we see today, I would say that in about 10 years, this is the optimist, we will see that same level of use. Now, most people might not necessarily be aware of it though. So like blockchain solutions and networks could be, they're supposed to be lower level, like the plumbing, the engineer, the plumbing of a house. You don't necessarily see it, but you use it. And that's what a lot of the infrastructure that's being built now is for. Now we do see some like immediate use cases and dApps and things that people can like see and build on, but back to my point, my answer is I do imagine that within 10 years from now, a majority of things, especially intellectual property, will be empowered, either run on or facilitated, managed in some way using blockchain-based solution. Now, the pessimist in me would say, give it 20 years, and we'll definitely see that. But I think 20 years would be a long time. I don't think it would take 20 years, maybe 15 years might be the sweet spot, but yeah. There's the good thing about this is I would say with intellectual property, it's not necessarily the sexiest topic in blockchain. From my point of view, it's fascinating, and I'm not like the money hungry type, but I mean, you guys saw the figures at the beginning of the slides. There's a lot, you know what I mean? There's a lot to be done. There's a lot of money to facilitate through this. But even though it's not necessarily like the headline grabber, like some other DeFi specific projects, it's something that is more easily understood and agreed with by institutions, whether they're businesses or even governance, that, okay, yes, this is something that has a very strong use case and could make our lives easier.
Thank you very much.
Oh, no problem. Thank you for that question. Juan, I see you have a question.
Yeah. Brilliant talk. Thanks, Dakota.
Thank you.
I was just thinking that, probably I guess a lot of students here might not have the kind of opportunity to, speak directly or to ask kind of founders directly about what their experience is of, founding a company in this space. So I'd like to ask, what was it that kind of got you into working on IP with InvArch, and is there any advice that you'd give for kind of people that are aspiring to fund a blockchain project?
Yeah. So thank you for that question. I've been told, so I'll just embrace it moving forward. But I definitely have a more unique founder like origin story, so to speak. So on one hand, yes, I've always been very interested in like government, politics. I've even had dinner with like a Supreme Court justice here in the United States. And when I say I was really into it, like I got into the thick of it really quick. I was just all about it. But on the other hand, which I tried my best to hide, I was extremely poor. I was an orphan. I was in foster care. Money and access were not typically things that I had close to me. And I did realize though, nor do my friends, but one thing that me and one friend in particular were always great at was we just have good ideas for things. We just share them. Like, I don't know if you've ever been talking with somebody about something you wish you had, or this would be cool. And we do that all the time. And I don't know what made it different this one time, but it was almost 6 years ago, actually, when I was sitting with my friend and he just starts going on about an idea that he had for a renewable like energy powered car. And it was very logical. I'll be honest, like the way that he was describing it, like everything, how it could function, wouldn't even need to ever be plugged into charge. It was brilliant. And I said, like, it got me excited. And I was like, why don't you make this? And he just laughed and he was like, yeah, right. Because I know how to build a car. You know what I mean? And we laughed a little bit. And with that, it took like, I don't know, 10 seconds passed. And I just had this, I'll never forget it, this light bulb moment. And I literally sprung out of my seat and I looked at him and I said, again, it's really not about the money, but I looked at him and I was like, I have $1 billion idea. And he was like, what do you mean? And I said, this is very different from what we have today. It's evolved a lot since, but in that moment, it was 6 years ago, I told him, I said, I want to create a platform that connects people who, I want to connect thinkers and doers. I want to connect people who have great ideas with those who have the skills and or resources to help bring that idea to life. That was the very, very simple first idea. Now, that idea over time started to kind of consume me. Like I increasingly, like I understood the significance of it. And of course, it's living in my head, the vision that I saw. I was very adamant about the good and the impact that this could have on a global scale. So began to take it increasingly more serious, started to just research. I love to research. I just love to learn about stuff. So I'm just going into all different fields, such as intellectual property, sharing. Like the big pain point was, okay, how do you protect something? Like, I don't want people to get Zuckerberg, as I said earlier. So if I share an idea with somebody, what stops them from saying awesome, I never hear from them again, and then they go and build it, and then cool, they made $1 million. You know what I mean? Like that's a pain point. How do we solve for that? And that was actually a huge pain point for a while. That's what then that question is then what got me into specifically intellectual property. Like that's where I then realized, okay, IP, this is actually a very foundational key point here, which we need to focus on and solve for. And it was really tricky for a long time. It was actually that trying to find solutions, which brought me to blockchain. A lot of people got into blockchain because they were making money, or they're doing this, or because their cousin told them to go buy into this, whatever token at a family dinner. Kudos to those who did well. Sorry for those who didn't. But for me, myself, I got into it just because of what it can do. It was the solution for what I was trying to solve. It either necessarily wasn't the full solution, but because of its existence, because of its technology, because of what can be built, I realized, okay, the solution that I'm looking for doesn't exist yet, but it can. We can build it, and we can build this network where these solutions are provided. And now on top of this network, remember, it's supposed to be the plumbing. On top of this network, now we can start to build not just this this collaboration app that I envision, but an array of different applications now that they're able to build on something, this foundation, which is able to properly attribute, define intellectual property, these digital primitives, proper digital primitives for storing it, and then providing tooling attached to these assets and these primitives, which help people to facilitate rights, to record agreements, to record instances of communication, all these things, so that at the least, as I said, everything is there. It's immutable, abstract. A lot of logic, business logic, can be trustless, can be completely controlled, executed on chain. But then even in the instance where there is, let's say, a pain point, we can at least make sure that we're providing all of the tooling necessary, for example, like integrations with DID solutions. So if you are communicating and working with someone, you can ensure that, like, you can have an application that someone's built, and one of the requirements is that it's essentially like KYC. We call it social KYC. So you're only doing business with someone that it's verifiable. Like, for example, this is Dakota Barnett, you know that. So if there is an instance where we can't provide like a smart contract to facilitate agreements properly 100%, you're collaborating with somebody, at the very least, you do know that, you know, Dakota Barnett was the one who did or didn't do X, Y, or Z, you know, and you can have this. So this is an instance where then it could make an attorney's life a lot easier. You don't necessarily need to spend time trying to prove things, more so just providing the proof and being like, yeah, judge, you know, what's up? That's not how it goes, but, but yeah.
That's always good. Cheers.
No problem. No problem. Thank you. So I never know how to behave when it's like the awkward quietness waiting for questions. So I'm usually, I do what I do now, and I just point that out, and I talk with filler text for a little bit.
I guess I have a question. This is kind of relating more to the thing you mentioned about NFTs earlier, where you said that a lot of people have a misconception about what exactly they are.
Yes.
And so I was wondering, especially, I guess, when it concerns like governments and there's suspicion of these kind of activities, at least like recently with the rise of kind of scam NFTs from celebrities like getting sponsored, how can, I guess, like blockchain as a whole improve its image, both for publicly and like for legislators to kind of look at less suspiciously?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. That's an important question. And it's a question that I don't want to say the answer, but I definitely have answers for. So there's many different fronts to digest that question. So what I mean is, like you said, so there's instances where you have, well, let me take it back even farther first, my bad. NFTs and what they are, what they can be. We've seen a lot of just the typical, here's your JPEG, here's this picture. But an NFT could also be used to, I'm going to not talk about future technology, I was talking about just today. This could be used, NFT you could store a licensing agreement or a patent. You could store that on IPFS and have it as an NFT, which is then connected to this person's verifiable identity. You could do something like that. Now, the former, the one I just talked about, it unfortunately, and it's what I was saying earlier, it's not as like financial, it's not as sexy. I don't know how else to say it. Like it doesn't, like, people really love, especially with new technology, they love to make money. And unfortunately, it comes with, just like with the initial rise of the internet, people exploit that, unfortunately. So I would say that regarding like the image, there's a mix of things that need to happen. First and foremost, the most important thing, but the one thing that I have the least amount of control over, is we need less people out there devising these what we call it a rug pull, but these scams, these scam projects. That is unfortunately something that we don't have control over. Now, there are consequences for those individuals. The big thing that we as an industry can make sure to do for like the actual active players in here who are really driving things forward and rather than exploiting things, is to have I think it's important that we have to some degree, unified narrative regarding the future of this technology, making sure that we take the conversation and redirect it off of just these simple NFT like art collections, not to dismiss from them. There are genuine artists out there. There are genuine communities out there who are doing some really fantastic, fascinating things based off of they have a collection, they get sales, it goes to the treasury, and they use that money to fund ideas. It's really awesome. But my thing is that it's hard for us to prevent like bad actors themselves, but it is important for us to make sure that we drive the narrative properly forward, that we continue to remind people about the use cases beyond what they've already seen. That's very important. And when it comes to, I want to say, moving beyond some of the negative things, I don't know, it just takes grit, I would say, like just grit and passion. Like, we know what we're doing. It's very unfortunate, like when a lot of like negative things come out in the press or like in the news and things like that. And it is almost always the result of a bad actor, someone who with poor intentions doing things that they should not ought to have been doing, things that generally nobody's really a big fan of, but unfortunately something that wasn't able to be stopped until it was realized to already be an exploit. So yeah, that's a tough question. It's a really good question. That's a very important question because it is something that I do care about. And I want people to understand that NFTs are, they're more than just the JPEGs. They're so much more than like these quick, like pump and dump scams. Like it's still very young. So just like with the internet, how people were very quick to exploit and take advantage, but and we see the boom and the bust, and we've seen that here in our industry as well. We see those cycles. But through the booms and the busts, you have teams like my own, like others, who are kind of blind. It's not about the financial markets, not about anything like that. We're here with a mission. There's things that we want to build. There's solutions that we want to provide. There is this, as mentioned earlier, like this kind of ideal utopian like vision for the future with all of this. But we just continue to strive towards that and hope that in the end, especially as we begin to deliver more actual products that people use in their day-to-day life, it'll essentially take the same shape of how the internet is today. It is mostly good, and most of the world knows it as good, and then we can help to better identify what those scams are together, and hopefully even start to provide and build out tooling for detecting and reporting scams on chain. That would be really awesome.
Thank you for the answer. I guess if anyone else has any questions, just please raise your hand as a final question. If not, forever hold your silence or reach out to Dakota on the socials that he showed earlier. Otherwise, thank you so much, Dakota, for giving the talk again. It was amazing and really insightful.
Thank you.
And I hope everyone has a good evening.
So thank you again for the opportunity. Thank you for inviting me to come speak to everybody. I hope I gave a fun, engaging conversation. I apologize for a little bit of jargon in there, but I really appreciate the opportunity. I love the chance to speak about this. So thank you again.
That's great to hear. Thank you again, and hopefully we can work together at some point in the future again.
Oh, absolutely. So there's a lot to talk about. So at the very least, I'd love to talk some more one day.
Definitely. Well, have a good evening, everyone. I'll turn off the meeting now.
All right. Take care. Thank you.